Canada. What a wonderful place, mostly because a not insubstantial number of my viewers come from here. The Great White North, with such novelties as snowy mountains, fresh water, and universal healthcare, which of course I disavow. Obviously, the best way to do things is to pay an army of middlemen to get even worse treatment than to die quickly buried in a mountain of medical debt, or as we call it, the American way. But someone who doesn't have to worry about this for a number of reasons is the most famous Canadian at Marvel, not you, Wade, Wolverine. Yep, he's the best he is at what he does, and that skill set doesn't really include knowing much about his past. Other than, I guess, being aware of the general region of the globe he was born in, which is, I guess, what allows him to declare this national identity. But here's the thing, Wolverine isn't exactly as old as you'd think he'd be, just by a simple glance. In fact, because of his regenerative healing factor, he's actually been walking the earth for much longer than the majority of folks in the Marvel universe. But while I was pondering the age of this immortal killing machine, I got to wondering, if he turns out to be older than the country whose roots he claims to derive from, does that actually make him a member of said nation? So that's what I want to figure out today. Is Wolverine Canadian?
I'm Canadian.
Does his birth date predate the founding of the greatest nation with a leaf on its flag? And does it even matter with Canadian birthright laws? So hold on to those dog tags that you can't remember where you got them from, and let's discuss. Wolverine is one of Marvel's most recognizable heroes. I mean, hell, back in the day, you couldn't find a school lunchbox that didn't have a combination of him, Spider-Man, and the Hulk on them. Originally created in 1974 by Len Wein and John Romita Sr., this yellow-clad, knife-wielding lunatic would make his debut in the Incredible Hulk issue number 181, where he'd face off against the Jolly Green Giant himself. And though in this issue he was something of an antagonist, I always find myself rooting for the little guy when they're up against some kind of unstoppable juggernaut. Kinda like how we here are going up against the dreaded YouTube algorithm, which as we all know favors larger creators over smaller ones like these guys. But by liking, commenting, subscribing, you can help us get our very own metal skeleton to face off against these overwhelming odds. I wonder how that's gonna affect the whole floating thing I've got going on. Anyway, shortly after his first appearance, Wolverine would appear alongside Marvel's Merry Mutants in Giant Size X-Men number 1, published in May of 1975, which would cement him as one of the core members of the team protecting Xavier's school of gifted youngsters, a position he still occupies to this day. And due to his rapid healing factor allowing him to recover from any injury, he has the added benefit of an extended longevity, allowing him to have existed for what might be several hundred years, which has led to a lot of writers having fun with the idea that he's an eternal warrior fighting in pretty much every single modern conflict up to as early as the 1800s. Wolverine in the comics has fought in World War I, II, Korea, and maybe a little bit of Vietnam before he was eventually captured by Weapons Plus, and then forcibly given that adamantium skeleton. After this, things can get kind of funny with Marvel's floating timeline, making it difficult to determine whether or not things like the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, or any other modern day conflict occurred in the Marvel universe. Also, considering the fact that he's the only X-Men that actually continues to age, means that they keep expanding the time between him getting the skeleton and meeting Charles and the rest of the gang and joining the giant-sized X-Men. In that time frame, at first he experiences something of a feral period, where after escaping the Weapon X facility, he's sort of just going crazy in the woods, until eventually he's found by James and Heather Hudson, who you might know as the leaders of Alpha Flight. And if you don't, yeah, that makes sense, they're Alpha Flight. But after helping him regain some of his humanity, Wolverine works as a secret agent for Department H, an organization under the Canadian government. This is actually how he ended up finding himself doing battle with the Hulk, and then shortly after this mission, he would go into retirement, and then just sort of lay low until eventually stumbling across Xavier and the gang. But why do I mention all this? Well, if you know anything about military life, you know there's a little bit more to the gig than just being given a gun and sent to the front lines, with a handful of bullets and a heart full of patriotism. Because before you can get to that point, there's usually a bit of a background check and some paperwork you gotta fill out, involving things like your citizenship, legal status, and of course, birth certificate. All which might be things that are a little bit difficult for someone like Wolverine to acquire, given his unique condition. And maybe in some earlier wars it's a bit easier to fall through the cracks, but over time it does feel like he would have needed to have gotten his paperwork together in order to participate in some of the more modern conflicts. Understandably, when he was working with Department H, they kind of just recognized his past was a mystery and forged whatever documentation he needed, viewing him as more of an asset and less of a person with a history they needed to bother with. But before this point, the guy was kind of on his own, hence why it might be relevant to know where he comes from, which is easier said than done. So where does Wolverine's story begin? Well, if you ask that Marvel comic, They claim that he was actually one of the very first mutants and or humans, forming over millions of years ago, being transformed from an actual Wolverine. But this is dumb and stupid and not in the fun way comic books usually are. So instead we're gonna ignore this orgy-filled retcon factory where they can't even get the comic book bubbles right, and instead move to his actual origins, which for a time were pretty shrouded in mystery. Being teased in small bits throughout the 70s and 80s since due to the procedure that gifted him that remarkable metal on his skeleton, which does indeed flow throughout his entire body, it also left him with a pretty spotty memory for everything that occurred to him before the experiment. And while it took a while for there to be a concrete tale woven as to where this little hairy man came from, those would all be put to rest with the seminal release of Wolverine Origin, a story following a young James Howlett, and the events that transformed him from this scrawny, sickly little rich kid to the immortal globe-trotting warrior looking for a battle that will finally put him to rest. And this story, flawed as it might be, did lay the groundwork for a lot of elements in the character that would be seen later on in his career. And one such key detail was that he is indeed born just north of the good old USA, more specifically, Alberta, Canada. But this is where things get a little bit technical, because while the comic firmly does state that this is Alberta, the issue with this is that wasn't the case for the majority of the century. At least if not assuming that the Marvel universe is paralleling our universe's timeline, where the province was first named in 1882, after Queen Victoria's fourth daughter, a name which maintained even when Alberta became an official province in 1905. Furthermore, the country of Canada itself was only founded in 1867, meaning that if Wolverine was born anytime before this, well then his designation as a Canadian citizen becomes a little bit more complicated. Luckily, after this comic book, and with a bit of help from our friendly neighborhood Marvel wiki, it has been stated that Wolverine was born during the late 1800s, meaning that at the very least, he did make it past this essential milestone to be born within the Canadian province after it is founded. But if we're going off of the movie timeline, which I guess isn't technically canon in the comics, but is still Wolverine that we're going to be seeing up until Hugh Jackman is and beyond 90. Till you're 90. Then things are a little bit more complicated with that 2009 film X-Men Origins Wolverine, placing his birth year quite a bit before the comic book one, all the way back in 1832. Meaning that this iteration of the character is actually older than the country he claims to be a part of. All this so we could see him fight in the American Civil War, presumably and hopefully for the North. But at least, hey, the comic book version is all set and good, so we can bring this thing to a close and say, the movie just got the timeline wrong, which is pretty much just a staple of the franchise.
Go f yourself.
However, this might not actually be as open and shut of a case as you might think, considering the fact that, though comic book Wolverine is not older than the country he claims the nationality of, him and his movie counterpart might still both have the problem that they'd be lacking official Canadian citizenship.
You bet I would. How can you listen to him after all he's done?
Well, even though the country was founded in the 1860s, the technical designation of citizen did not yet exist. But to get to the bottom of this, first we need to look into some of Canada's history. During the early years of Canada's colonization, several European nations were vying for the control of the land, meaning that they would divide up the region into different provinces, with distinct laws and organizations governing them. The most predominant in the northern region were the British, and therefore the denizens and colonials who took up residency here would still be under the rule of their empire. Granted, if you're an indigenous person, it doesn't really matter what governing power was coming your way, they kind of both were screwing you over. You know, it's pretty f***ed up when you think about it.
Are we the baddies?
Back to Wolverine, regardless of what origin you end up looking at, he always seems to be born in British territory. That means he would still be a subject under Queen and Crown, regardless of if he was born before or after the country was founded. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1947 that Canadian citizenship could be separated from the British entirely. This is due to in 1946 the federal parliament enacting the Canadian Citizenship Act, which would fully grant them their independence. And no matter what origin of Wolverine you're looking at, he was definitely born before 1946. So regardless of what his status is, one thing we can definitely say for certain is that under the legal sense, Wolverine is British. Which was also possibly the case with that one version of Wolverine who was Australian.
How you doing? Want a piece of fruit?
But yeah, those born around the 1880s like Wolverine from the comics would have something of a dual identity, considering themselves geographically born in Canada, but British in national identity. He also might have had a British accent himself, but I imagine that might have faded over time, considering how long he spent stateside and his globetrotting. But yeah, either way, movie or comic, neither version of Wolverine would officially have a Canadian citizenship when they were born, since the thing just didn't exist during either of their birth years. However, there definitely were people who did survive between the pre-1867 era and the 1947 modern era where Canadian citizenship was established. Since again, this was only 80 years and it was quite possible for people back then to live that long, though it was a little bit less common than it is now, plenty of folks would be able to experience this transition, and the order of operations would go at first, they would just be a British colonial, living in the land that would one day be Canada, and then after the country was founded, they would be in the domain of Canada while still being subject to British law, only for them to finally be considered Canadian citizens with the passing of the Canadian Citizenship Act. And as I said, this applies to both his comic and movie counterpart, but regardless of what version of Wolverine we're talking about, his paperwork and documentation would probably not have been all that important up until about the 30s and 40s. And in that regard, he's probably presented nothing but false identities and information, because for one, he's like older than dirt, and therefore his real paperwork just wouldn't make much sense. And for second, he was kind of declared dead by his grandfather during the events of that origin comic, where he and his childhood friend Rose had to flee the mansion after the deaths of Logan's mother and father and the groundskeeper, who turns out was Wolverine's biological father. And when Logan and Rose fled and ended up working in this mining quarry, they did, as expected, use fake aliases, which is actually what the name Logan is, considering he was born James Howlett. And before the digital era, it might have been a bit easier to slip between the cracks for someone like him, but in the modern day, I imagine Logan's legal distinction and record keeping is conducted by none other than the government agency known as S.H.I.E.L.D., due in no small part to his close relationship with its director, Nick Fury, who, like me, understand the nature of Logan's situation, and also thanks to the incoherent number of hoops you have to jump through in order to get your rights recognized as complete and utter nonsense.
Oh, that darn paperwork. Wouldn't it be easier if it all just blew away?
So I imagine he would just cook the books and carve out an exception for someone he knows and considers to be a valuable asset. Because otherwise Logan's birthday would place him around 150 years old, which technically I guess isn't exactly illegal, just kind of unheard of for most humans. But he would also still have to find the records, indicating that he was indeed born in Alberta during the 1800s, and prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that he was the same person. But say this did all work out and Logan's paperwork was able to be transitioned from that initial British subject distinction, he still would technically be able to claim Canadian citizenship under Canadian law. So yes, to make a long story short, Logan would indeed be able to be considered Canadian, even in a legal sense. And this would actually apply to even the movie version as well, because though born before the country was founded, those born within the region were retroactively made Canadian, at least by the 1940s. And even for someone like Wolverine who has friends in high places, it probably would have still been possible for him to explain his situation, so long as the world was, aware of mutants and the fact that some people can just violate the laws of physics. It probably would require him to jump through a few more hoops, and I imagine that he might get investigations into fraud for the number of times he's presented false identities in order to serve in the military. Plus, he also just does crimes in general. But if he was so inclined, he could straighten out his situation and be both colloquially and legally referred to as Canadian. But to wrap things up, Logan's legal predicament is one I just find endlessly fascinating, considering all the technical issues that might occur with someone as long-lived as him. All too often, we just kind of assume that with an extended lifespan, you can kind of just keep pretending you're your own descendants, or find some way to game the system. But were we in a world where you can just accept that people can live a really long time? It would just be extremely interesting to see how one's legal status would change with the rising and falling of different governments and nations. It's also just cool to think about all the other distinctions that would fall upon him, just based on the fact that there have been so many different flags that this guy has lived under. And even if we're going with the movies version where he's a bit older, or the comic version from the 1880s, either way it does seem like a pretty straightforward process for him to get his records updated and be a proud citizen of the country of Canada. By the way, if he's not using that free healthcare that they offer, you think I could take his place? Because it's getting really hard to find insurance that will cover a balloon who recreationally uses pins to pop every single week. Hey, thanks for watching. If you stuck all the way to the end, why not check out another one of our videos on screen now? And if you'd like to chat with us directly, come join our Discord. Link in the description below.